Hi, friends. Thanks for being here. Really excited to see you all as we wait for people to sort of spool in. It's rolling up rapidly. Feel free to drop in the chat where you're chiming in from. I'd love to see who's all here. I've already seen some of my favorite people. Melissa, great to see you. Phoenix, Joanna, and San Antonio. Oh, been a long time. We have to get out there and have some barbecue sometime. Allison from Boston, we got Kansas City, Des Moines. Hi, Amy. Great to see you. San Diego. Seen a lot of my good friends in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. Carmen, Catherine. So excited to see so many of you. Thank you for joining. If you're just joining, we're dropping in the chat where we're from. And I'm trying to scroll through. There's so many names and so many of my favorite people. I'm really glad to spend some time with you, even though you're probably just hearing from me, but hopefully we have a chance to connect. Right, we're going to give it a few more minutes. Montreal, thank you for calling in. Boston, Chicago, foot of snow in Cincinnati. We didn't get hit with this last snowstorm, but it's certainly been cold here in Minneapolis. So our snow hasn't gone anywhere. All right, I think we're getting pretty close here. We're about half of the registrants in, which is usually about normal for a webinar, about the time to get started. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. One of my favorite times of the year to talk about the year that just was and the year that we're going into. And when I wrote my comments and put this deck together and everything, I have to say a lot's changed in my hometown of Minneapolis the last couple of weeks. Certainly, those of you who watched the news have certainly seen that, and it's been a tricky time here. And I'm not going to spend much time addressing it, but I did want to say up front, just my heart goes out to everyone in the Minneapolis area. It's been very trying and challenging for our staff, being a Minnesota-based company, being in the Minneapolis area, looking out my window at downtown Minneapolis right now. But at the same time, there's also, despite the unsettling news and all the challenges, the pain and suffering we're dealing with, there's also so much hope and optimism, especially from the nonprofit community. Seeing just an outpouring, helping people in our community. So many of you from outside of our state donating. I know we're getting record donations at some of the nonprofits, and it's such a great opportunity to think about why we're really in this business, this opportunity to help people. And it doesn't even need to be a nonprofit. I mean, generosity knows no organization. It's just giving to people in need, and those people are probably in your backyard. And even though we're going to talk about the big trends in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, just remember that benevolence in the field that we're a part of and how meaningful that is. So think about that when if you have a friend shut into their house, especially my friends in the Minneapolis area. Bring them food, just bring them a hug, and it's just such a great opportunity to show that we care when it feels like there's so much lack of caring perhaps around us in many different avenues. So thank you for letting me say that. I'm gonna have this be a really I think a positive and conversation about the year we just had and the trends in 2026 and how we can move forward with so much uncertainty. Certainly, that might be the acute uncertainty at the moment, but there's so much all around us. And I'm going to start by talking about as we headed into 2025, kind of what all happened. I suppose I should say some administrative things first. Certainly, the slides are going to be available. You saw that at the top of the chat. If you have questions, please do use the Q&A. I'm going to try to look at those questions and maybe answer a few online or get back to you otherwise, if not. Or general comments, feel free to use the chat. I think everyone can see chat comments, so feel free to include those as well. And I'll have a block at the end of the time where we can have some dialogue. So heading into 2025, I mean, there was a lot. I mean, if we think about the year, we just had an election, so there's a change in leadership in Washington. Inflation, which had been so much of the story coming out of the pandemic years, was starting to moderate. It was looking actually okay. The S&P 500 had a really big climb again as a 25% growth in 2024 going into 2025. And frankly, the affluent felt pretty good. And the affluent often do drive our sector, certainly in terms of the dollars being raised and the totals. It's very much driven by the affluent. And in that population, there was optimism. Despite that, there continued to be apprehension on Main Street, everyday people, which certainly shows itself in giving statistics. Maybe not as much in the dollars, but in the participation, the engagement, the feelings of is philanthropy for me, is philanthropy of the rich? And we heard some of those conversations, but certainly in terms of how it fared for numbers and for our major gift and principal gift programs, really the economic markers were really good going into 2025. And sure enough, the year-end final results, which came out in June of 2025 for the calendar year 2024, were a record year in terms of current reported dollars. We had never reported in the year itself 592 billion, and this is from the Giving USA data. Certainly through inflation adjustments, 2021 is a bigger year because inflation adjusted, it's up in the 620s. But we're nearly hit 600 billion in current dollars within the year 2024. So definitely a large year for giving. It continues to be about 2% of the GDP in terms of relative positioning. And perhaps it tracks less with the GDP. Sometimes we'll see GDP going up and giving going down, GDP going down and giving going up. It's really more a correlative measure as giving has lean more and more on affluent populations. We've seen the value of asset markets, the stock market, the inflation of assets being more of a driver of the overall giving dollars and more predictive. For example, in 2021, there was a very large growth in the S&P 500. In 2022, in the fourth quarter, we had a big dip down. And especially when that dip is late in the year, fourth quarter being really the top year in the calendar, the top part of the year in a calendar year for philanthropy, it pulls the giving down. So we did see a decline from 21 to 22. But the stock market has been cooperating in terms of prediction on philanthropy and philanthropic dollars. And what we've seen, and this is a trend that's been going on for some time, is that while individuals remain the largest source of giving, the percentage that comes directly from individuals, so they wrote a check, they donated stock, they gave the money right from an individual to the charity, has been declining from peaks pushing 80% down to about 66% right now. But it should be pointed out that obviously bequests are individuals after they've met certain actuarial realities. And foundations are many family foundations or people giving through their donor advised fund in structured ways. We would still estimate 80 to 85% of decisions to make a gift were made by one individual. So very much the case that probably 80+% of giving decisions were made by individuals, even if they were given through a company, through a foundation, through their donor advised fund. And mega gifts were kind of on par for past years, about 11, 12 billion. And when we say mega gifts, it's really a specific term related to the Giving USA data because some of it is econometric models that are the 2 years until the IRS e-filing catches up with the reporting, which is why you see revisions year after year. But if you go back 2 to 3 years on the current report, back 2 to 3 years, that's final numbers. And what we see is that there's certain mega gifts that are outside the econometric models where they're going to affect the forecast. And there's a line driven on those, roughly 100 million plus up to 300 million plus. It used to be much lower, but as gift sizes go increase, the amount that impact the prediction has gone up as well. So the strong GDP and profits did really help corporate giving. Corporations do relate a lot to gross domestic product production. Certainly, their corporate profits are the biggest driver of their giving. And they've been on a tear. Really, for 5 years, we've seen record growth in the corporate sector, 30% growth in the last 5 years. Now, profits have grown even more so. And what we've seen in comparison to, say, like in the 1980s, where about 2% of corporate profits were given charitably, it's around 1% now, 1.1% in the last completed year on record. If you think way back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, where we had, like in my hometown of Minneapolis, the 5% club, that companies would give 5%, the percent that's given to charity is less. Many would counter that the amount invested for corporate benevolence in other ways that might not be giving gifts to directly to charities is still at around 2%, and they might include other environmental initiatives, diversity initiatives, and other things which they view as a corporate good, not specifically for the pursuit of profits. But as with all corporate giving, there's often benefit in their giving. Now, there's a lot of concerns in the tax bill, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but the tax legislation might adversely affect this trend. We've seen 5 years of growth. A lot of people are predicting corporate giving is going to go the other way. And I think there's legitimate reasons to think that's the case, at least that the behavior of corporate giving is going to change and manifest itself in new ways. So the giving by corporations has been up largely because their profits were up and GDP was up. And that's been the trend that was going into 2025 and certainly likely observable within 25 as well. Now, if we looked at the sectors, pretty much all the sectors grew in current dollars. Religion was the only one that didn't keep up with inflation. And that has been, as a percent of the total giving, has declined over many decades, where back in the 1950s, when Giving USA started, it was 75% of giving and so forth. But what we found is where we saw the sectors growing the most are those that had deeply invested in relational giving programs, high net worth, major giving. Those that have aligned to those sectors have seen some of the biggest growth. Public society benefit, a lot of that growth is the donor advised fund. The National Donor Advised Fund sponsoring groups are generally categorized in the public and society benefit category. That's where your Fidelity Charitable, your Schwab, your Vanguard, some of the large donor advised fund organizations are in public society benefit. So the growth there might be more of a nature of those high net worth, building different mechanisms for giving. Certainly, there's other categories that had some growth within public society benefit. International affairs has largely been in relation to international events. Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, other areas of international giving has had some effect, especially in 2024 on the international growth. So sector growth across the board, it was really a good year going into 2025. The strongest subsectors continued this shift. There's that decline of religion. If you see, this is just over 40 years, which is that mark from 62% to 23%. Certainly, as I mentioned, being much higher if we go back to as far back as the 1950s and 60s. Education has historically been the second highest for years. Human services, the last 2 years in a row, has passed up education. They're very, very statistically close. I would say they're statistical ties. Human services slightly ahead, but you can see a great diversification. Some of the subsequent reports we've seen on giving by generations marks a generational shift, where religion is still the top recipient of all the generational groups, this kind of the standard groups we hear from demographers. What we've seen is while baby boom generations often list education second, it's down to perhaps third or fourth. I believe it might even be fifth for Gen X, down to sixth in millennial and eighth or ninth for the Gen Z, where we're seeing bigger growth in other areas, healthcare, the environment in the younger generations. So there's some shifting that's generational, and some shifting that is just a matter of historically, as I mentioned, philanthropy has often followed the affluent. Education was of the sectors the most aligned to affluent populations. And we know this through common sense. We see names on buildings, we hear about big benefactors, certainly large research agendas, and the affluent do like big problems to be solved, and education is good at solving really big problems. But we've seen investment in a shift in business model to build relational programs across different sectors, from human services to health to arts and culture, where we're seeing much more of a buildup of major gift officers supporting infrastructure for major gift fundraising in areas such as prospect development, identifying prospects, feeding a pipeline, donor relations, really addressing what's the donor experience, individualized volunteer engagement around giving and so forth. So we're seeing a distribution of the business model, historically more common in education and academic medicine, spreading to other sectors, which is a contributing factor to their rise. The buildup and the growth is in the major gift populations as a whole in terms of dollars, but that doesn't mean that there's not also hope for the base of support. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk. Now, the subsectors that grew going into 2025 were those that were mostly recovering from past declines. In many ways, we're starting to see I hate to say a new normal because what is normal, but in terms of predictable giving patterns coming out of what was a large period of disruption post-pandemic and social justice shifts in terms of designation preferences and so forth. And what we saw is a lot of the groups that had declines in the year before have recovered, and they're in what we would say is perhaps predictable avenues of growth. 2024 going into 25 showed almost a righting of philanthropy. And those areas that saw double-digit growth were recovering from past weaker years in 2023. Now, so that's what was going into 2025. But we're talking about the year of 2025. And I think that's important because we don't really know what happened at the end of 2024 till the middle of 2025. So I think it's an important time to talk about that. Likewise, we're not going to know the final numbers of 2025 till June of 2026. But what happened during this year? I would say it was a year of uncertainty, but also a year of growth. Many people marked the year as a year of cognitive dissonance, where things were very big negatives, but then they also saw really big positives at the same time. And they didn't understand, why is giving going up when there's so much stress, uncertainty, and factors that you would typically expect would cause giving not to grow. But we've seen growth anecdotally, even though the numbers aren't final, and I'll talk about that in a second. And some of those changes in the year that most people point to was perhaps initially in the beginning of the year, the talk was mainly around the changes in government support. It definitely created a strain on the nonprofit sector, but it also increased the need for private support. And this was sort of mixed, where some organizations were having to lay off and reduce staffing, even including the fundraising area. Others saw more emphasis on fundraising staffing, for example. And I should point out, while I talked about the affluent often driving the philanthropic totals and the trends, a very small portion of the population are the affluent. And similarly, the vast majority of donors were not as financially able to give this past year. Similarly, for the sectors within the nonprofit sector. So the ones that from the pie chart, just a few slides before, human services, to the environment, to the arts, even though we're seeing those groups grow, what we're often finding is it's the top organizations, likely around the 10%, and I'm doing a quick summary, are growing considerably, and the majority are not. So there's sort of a haves and have-nots within the sectors. So let's say you're out of human services and like, wow, we didn't grow at that percentage. The very large ones are growing at a level that it's almost casting a shadow for what was real challenges within the sectors. So this change in government support was felt, and it was felt broadly and across different sectors. Certainly the USAID was very much felt in the international affairs area, and those doing work in other countries, where it had a huge impact on them. We had one client that had to lay off as many as 60% of their workforce. Very, very difficult time for them. Certainly in higher education and academic medicine, which historically have had some of the largest giving dollars and growth, especially from the high net worth, they were very much affected by the pulling back and the cuts of the NIH, the National Institute of Health funding, towards research grants. And where we saw perhaps research funding declining, but there was still some large philanthropic gifts to research. Nevertheless, that puts a strain on the organizations on the full dollars of how to operate and to achieve those big successes that they've had. U.S. funding is fewer grants in every area of science and medicine. In addition, there's a lot of challenges, especially in the higher education sector, around the colleges, their speech, their DEI initiatives, tuition freezes, and compacts that certainly had an impact. A lot of opinions from donors, a lot of opinions from administrations, strain on administrations, and opportunities to navigate a new reality, at least within this time period. So that was the biggest, perhaps, story in the first part of the year. Also, might be pointed out as this one big beautiful bill that goes into effect in 2026. We're in it now. The year of 2025 is the last year before that goes into effect, meaning that there's probably impacts on 2025 in anticipation of that bill being in effect and likely impact on 2026. Some of the most targeted elements, certainly there's a lot to this bill, and I'm summarizing it for the sake of keeping us to about 45 minutes of content here, is sort of the caps and floors for individuals, the first 0.5% of their adjusted gross income not deductible, and moving from a cap of 37% down to 35%. But perhaps a big win that we should celebrate as a sector, and a lot of credit goes to the Charitable Giving Coalition, Brian Flavin and Case, others that were working really hard, is that there is a universal charitable deduction. Certainly, most of you are well versed in it, but just for the sake of describing it and summarizing it, this means that if you do not itemize your taxes, but you take the standard deduction, historically you've not been able to then deduct additional for your charitable gifts. Starting in 2026, if you take the standard deduction, you are allowed as an individual and as a household to deduct charitable gifts on top of the standard deduction. Now there's still that 0.5% AGI floor, but up to about 2,000, I think it's 2,000 per household. Above that is deductible. So there is something that for the everyday donor that is a benefit. Uh, Often it's pointed out that those that this benefits are the ones least likely to follow any news about tax. I know half of you are probably, oh no, he's talking about tax. It's my time to tune out, check my phone, check what's happening on TikTok. But nevertheless, this is a value to the annual, the regular donors, the everyday donors, that they get an actual additional benefit for their giving in 2026. The tiered endowment tax for the larger schools and higher education is one that our sectors talked a lot about, actually taxing endowment. There was some benefit that the smaller schools had some exemption from that. And then what I mentioned before on the corporate giving is there's a corporate floor. As you recall, the US average giving from the percent of pre-tax profits was 1.1%. The corporate floor is now moved to 1%, or the new floor is 1% of profits are not deductible, which means it's pretty much wiping out the average. Now, certainly that's a bell curve. There are some corporations that give more than 1%, but on average, it's no longer deductible, that first 1%. Now, this causes many to think that there will be bunching behaviors or a decrease in annualized corporate giving. For example, if they were to give 1% each year, that would not be beneficial tax-wise. But perhaps they give 0% one year and 2% the next, then half of their gift is deductible in that year. Are we going to see bunching between years as opposed to a straight annual type of giving? It's hard to know. We're kind of seeing what's going to happen in the corporate sector and how they're reacting to this. And there's a lot of changes, and for many of them, their corporate giving, especially like at I should say it's probably about 11%. I shouldn't say many, but a lot. I guess 11% of corporations is still a lot of money. Are point of sale gifts where the consumer is actually giving the gift, but the corporation is taking that deduction. Is there going to be impact on that? Maybe less so since they're not losing that money, but it's not a deduction. So is there as much drive to set up new point of sale type of gifts? It's there's a lot of questions in this area likely to affect fundraising in 2026. Now, one of the biggest stories really in April of 2025 was the tariff shock. And it was kind of a shock to the system. And I'd say from the economist perspective and the good friends I have in the Giving USA board and the wonderful people at the Indiana School of University, sorry, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University and Purdue University in Indianapolis. Oh, it's a mouthful. But when I talk to the other economists and so forth, they say pray for a early dip down and not a late dip down, meaning dips like we saw in 2023 that happened in the fourth quarter pull the philanthropic dollars down more so than dips early in the year. And this dip down was considerable early in the year. In fact, some sectors, like you can see technology, where it was at April 7th versus should actually say December 31st. You find the typos in place. So it's actually December 31st is the chart on the right. From April 7th to December 31st, it was a 42.5 point swing. So those that bought the dip did quite well. The other one that had a 40+% swing was in basic materials, going from a decline at the point of the tariffs of almost 7% to being up almost 36% by the end of the year. So it looked pretty bleak in April. I remember talking with some of our clients around how should they adjust their corporate giving, knowing what a hit the tariffs are going to be to them. And I remember I was going to give one presentation right at the right at this time, at April 7th or so. And I was writing my slides in advance and sending them to the client. And then the next day, I'm like, oh, the sectors are moving around more. I've updated the slides. And then the next day, oh, I've had to update the slides again. Finally, I was like, you know what? I'm going to update the returns the morning of the 7th, just because they're changing so quickly, so rapidly, and there's so much uncertainty. And a lot of the thoughts from economists were around inflation, but also economists pointing out that tariff-related inflation is usually more transitory. It happens kind of a one-time as opposed to sustained inflation that comes from monetary imbalances and monetary policy. So it might have been a short-lived pain that recovered. Nevertheless, people seem to soldier through. The way the direction went and the impact was not as deep financially as the expectations were, and they countered with optimism in the market. So we did see an end of the year that saw considerable growth in the S&P 500, I believe over 16% growth. So when we look at the year for the markets in 2025, it was good. You can see this chart on the left where we've got this dip down in April and then growth since then. So from a dip down to a climb up to about a 16% growth. It was third straight year of stellar gains, and it's very uncommon that we'd see gains and not see giving going up. In fact, all the markers that we would expect around giving being up were largely up this last year. Earnings growth, estimated 12 to 14% growth. Expected revenue growth, not finalized yet, around 6.9%. Almost all the major indices had record highs. Even interest rates were moderating. Now, they weren't quite where everyone wants them to be, from 7% down to below 6%. But the last bullet here around interest rates is probably what the White House and what the government is the most interested in because of the sizable debt refi that's in front of them. Many are saying they so desperately need interest rates to go down. Put on your tinfoil hats, people are they're going to create black swan events, other things that cause disruption that would affect yield rates and bring rates down. Certainly pressure on the Federal Reserve when we've seen plenty of pressure from Washington on the Federal Reserve. The reality behind that and a lot of movement is they really want interest rates to go down because it helps from financing, and we're talking trillion-dollar decisions around these interest rates. So I don't expect that pressure to come down anytime soon. I know people are not expecting a change in the next Fed meeting. In fact, I think if you bet on Kalshi or against things, it's probably not a great bet to bet for a decline right now. The overwhelming consensus is that it will not. But hey, if they do bring it down, you'll make some money off of that bet. I should note I'm not recommending gambling. I'm just saying I've found that to be an interesting bet on where people's senses are around economic realities is what they're betting on these new betting apps and so forth. Now, the upward movement is likely to continue to favor major principal gifts. Everything we're seeing, and it's almost cliched to talk about the K-shaped economy, but it's really the reality that we're in. The affluent Americans continue to get ahead, and the low-income asset households, the majority of households, are not. And frankly, we're seeing that in retail spending. In September of last year, nearly half of U.S. retail spending came from the top 10% of earners, meaning like of all the goods and services that are purchased, half of them are just from 10% of earners when they're being purchased. So this is not just a philanthropy only. When we say philanthropy is becoming a thing of the rich, the economy is becoming a thing of a rich in many ways. Now that on one hand, speaks well for the charitable sector in terms of dollars. It doesn't speak well to the charitable sector in terms of a cultural value. If someone cannot afford bread or milk or gas in their car to get to work, given the bus and so forth, they're not going to prioritize giving. That said, like the moments here in my backyard in Minneapolis, people are giving, they're giving to their friends and neighbors. Generosity is more powerful than economics, and I'm always blown away by the generosity we see, especially from our vantage point, seeing a broad cross section, not only of US generosity, but around the world. Generosity is amazing value that even those that have less continue to give, and we do see giving continue. Now, that said, there were some mega gifts in 2025, and mostly from the usual cast of characters, names that are not surprising to you: Phil Knight, Warren Buffett, the Bezos, Moritz, certainly. We've seen large gifts from Mike Moritz. I think Greg Williams was of the top 10 biggest gifts, was the newer one to Michigan State, to the list. Certainly a generous donor, but at this level, a first time appearing on this list. But the mega gifts keep continuing and the numbers keep going up. We're seeing gifts in very high numbers that even 10 years ago would have thought to be unheard of, when the $100 million gift was amazing. And certainly for most of us, that would be game changing. And it is amazing. But just the scale of philanthropy continues to surprise us, and perhaps the people giving less so, that it's similar people. But it also begs the question: there's lots of billionaires out there that are not on this list, and what a great opportunity to help them use some of those resources to further good in the world, and nonprofits that have great solutions to big problems that can help them find significance through their charitable giving. People that give large gifts are rarely regretful of it. In fact, for many of them, it's one of the most important things they ever did. Now, Bank of America did their high net worth study. Is certainly a lower level than these mega gifts I just talked about, but broadly covers that top 5% of giving. And our team, my team member Dennis Prescott, did a paper on this that maybe many of you have read. But just to summarize some of the trends from that paper and from the Bank of America study, is reminding us about some of the truths that donors are motivated not just by what you do, but their own personal values and how those line. 90% of donors find their giving deeply personally fulfilling. And that's really driving them. So that value communication is still so important. Volunteering continues to be a gateway to major giving. And when we say volunteering, it is the everyday volunteering, but it's also being on a board. It is helping in a campaign committee. It's being part of the fundraising process. What we find is that 43% of affluent Americans are also volunteering, and they give 2.5 times more if they also volunteer in addition to their giving. And we see that as a multiple after volunteering. So it is causal, not just correlative, that volunteering is a gateway to major giving. Strategic giving is the new normal. And we saw that in the trends of individuals to corporate structures, foundations, and corporations. Nearly 1 in 4 now give through donor advised funds, family foundations, or other structured vehicles. I don't remember the exact counts, but I believe it was something around a couple thousand family offices 10 years ago, and it's maybe pushing 8,000 family offices now. We're seeing more structure around wealth, which is manifesting itself in structuring around giving. And part of that family office concept is there's a need for engaging families, not just the quote unquote patriarch whose name is on the building, but the adult children and those families that are all around that. And sometimes it's not the person whose name is there that's making the key giving decisions, but and many of them have this need to help my kids be well versed in philanthropy because it's so important to me. And what we see is the need to tailor strategies even within the segments of the high net worth. For many, it's their annual fund or their base of support or membership, depending on what field they're grateful patient. And then there's the major gift program. Certainly, we've seen the emergence of principal gift programs, but even within strata of those, we're seeing different rates of support, arguing for even more segmentation in the higher segments, from 1 million to 5 million. If you're a large organization, 10 and 25, that these donors give differently. And there's important to tailor towards those levels. So this kind of haves and have-nots has also been the case in corporate giving. The CECP Summit, which is the gathering of the people behind corporate giving, it should be pointed out that actually the median total community investment has decreased. So I just said corporate giving was on a tear, and it has, but the median, which is the middle, that means there's 50% or higher, 50% or lower. The median has actually decreased. In fact, from decreased 5% from 34.1 million to 32.6 million between 2022 and 2024. But the top quartile, which are very large companies, increased by 1%. And that increase at the top pulled all of corporate giving up. You see, I mentioned 30% over the last 5 years. It's also being driven by the very large companies. So we're seeing large companies, large individuals, and larger charities are really telling the aggregate dollar story of philanthropy, but they're not telling the whole story because donors continue to disappear in their participation in giving. Now, again, we saw donors decline. This is not new. Every year I talk about donors declining. It's not as steep as it has been in the past, about a 3% decline. The last, I think this was from the Q3 report from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. Again, Giving USA does not track that. The Fundraising Effectiveness Project is the largest study on donor counts decline. That's a partnership between AFP, Giving Tuesday, and a wonderful board of volunteers representing a lot of the service organizations, technology, CRM companies in our space. While the dollars have increased, the donor counts have gone down. There's been a little bit of retention. Retention is really key to donor counts, but certainly they have been going down, and that's been consistent. Now, we did have one segment that went up, and I'm going to humble brag a little bit. Our clients actually showed an increase of 8.3% in 2025 in donor counts. We're really proud of this team. We think they're killing it right now. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm not here to do a commercial. I'm really talking about the year in review, but I can't help but be so proud of our team of working so hard. In many ways, it's not rational for a company like ours to align a strategy towards an area that's declining in economic realities. But we're a mission-driven organization that's driven by philanthropy and generosity and doing good in the world. And we think it's important that giving is embraced by all. And we've worked really hard to reverse some of those. There was a wonderful redefining the annual giving playbook by Anshu and Zach from our team. And we've seen some great success there. So I'm really proud of this team. The other things we've seen this year is while there's been a rapid start and stop of AI companies, it's certainly, if you want PE funding, you're probably going to have to put the word AI in there someplace. I'd say we're kind of moving from experimental to operational. There's definitely been an increased focus also on first-party data and inputs. And what I mean by that is a lot of the generative AI is sort of open data available to all. How do we focus more of our AI within the data within our universe, our first-party data? And that's not just in the generative, it's also in the predictive space, like predictive AI using first-party data to predict giving patterns. I know with our own AI, we kind of patterned it off of Amazon. If you think about people that buy goods and services and do marketing, historically, marketing was third party. You buy warranty cards or magazine data and find out which populations also gave to you and you would or bought your product, and then you would target market based on that third party demographic data. Amazon kind of shifted things and said, actually, what's more predictive is how you behave at Amazon. Let's look at our first party data on how you buy things, how you shop, and to prompt that. And we're finding doing the same thing with predicting giving behaviors using first party data adds an element that is so much stronger. Of course, there's certain protections that are necessary, and we're not going to do a whole discussion on AI, but in making sure that our data is not exposed in a third-party universe. And I think people are getting their arms around it. Probably everyone in your office is using AI, whether or not you sanction it. So finding a way for us to have good policies around it, to use it and use it in an appropriate way with our data is so important right now. Now, I recently, just a couple of weeks ago, met with we gathered from our clients leaders from higher education. We took the chief development officer, the leadership from 45 colleges and universities. And we asked them, like, how was your year in 2025? Because we heard so many mixed things. I mentioned there's this year of cognitive dissonance. There was so much stress, especially this is specific to the higher education segment, so much stress on the segment from trust, from government actions, from overall trends in terms of generational shifts. But how was your year? And we actually found 80% of our the higher education places we polled grew last year, or 15 of them of this 45 actually had a record year. So a third of them had their record year from this small sample. Now, this is not statistically representative. It was 45, high touch. It was a qualitative environment. But this is what we continued to see throughout this year. We're talking to people, how's your year? And they're like, it's really tough for our sector, but we're doing really well. And then we talk to the next person, like, how was it for you? And like, well, it's really tough right now, but curiously, we're having a record year. And that was a very common story. Now, I talked about going into 2025, what happened in 2025, and knowing that I can't cover everything in this time period, I try to get some of the big stories specifically affecting philanthropy, and there's just so much more to tell. But as we go to 2026, it's feeling like we've got similar economic tailwinds going into 2026. I mentioned all those markers that have been consistent with giving going up were also up in 2025. I'd be very surprised if giving does not go up. Now, this is not official. This is just Josh and his opinion, his digging into data all the time, becoming a nerd about economics. But I would guess us to be certainly north of 600 billion. I would guess in the 16s, maybe even pushing 620 would be my guess. This is just my estimate from my knowledge. I think some of the themes in 2026 is how we're adapting to the K-shaped recovery. We're seeing some business model shifts because of that, and we're seeing some focus around technology applications. And again, as I'm going through these, think of some of the things that you have in mind. Put them in the chat, add them to the Q&A. I will try to get to some of them. I already find myself talking too long for the time period. But I'm going to address a few things. I do believe 2025 numbers will show another year of growth. We had 16.4% growth in the S&P 500. I also think the tax bill, which there's this move from 37 to 35%. I think financial advisors, in fact, I've talked with many, have been advising their clients. If you're thinking about giving this year or next year, maybe front loaded into this year, we might get a front load bump because of the tax bill from some of the wealthy populations where we might not see effect for the base until next year. So a combination of the market, which I'm summarizing down. I'm using this S&P 500 as the one evidence of that for this slide, as well as preemptive tax moves. I do expect that the final numbers will be up when the reports come out in June. And those are not reported yet, so I don't have any inside knowledge on that. Now, next, we expect growth globally, and we're seeing plenty of reports. I've been spending time going around, talking to people internationally. I spent some time in England meeting with some folks over there from large banks as well, and what they're seeing in trends globally. And we're expecting growth in global giving, likely in some of the wealthier communities that are not surprised as Singapore, Hong Kong, UAE had a very large growth of billionaires moving to UAE. Europe, we're mainly seeing it in Western UK. The Nordic countries are doing well. Switzerland has some positive marks towards its growth in philanthropy, but certainly other pockets around the world, even though there might be some difficulties in regulatory and other things, there's likely some growth in India and some growth in pockets within Africa, probably more localized to specific entities. But we are expecting some global giving to increase. Now, there's not a great measure to know if I was right on that. There is Cases doing a nice job in higher education and education broadly. It's something we're working towards getting a global measure on this, and certainly Giving USA has been sponsoring a fellow at the Indiana University to do work in global. And so, in addition to my CEO role at BWF, I've been really proud to be on the board of Giving USA many years and help to steer towards global philanthropy with my good friend and co-chair of the Global Philanthropy Committee, Rick Dunham. The two of us are working really hard to get better measurement on global philanthropy. A third trend we're likely to see in this year, which I've also alluded to last year at this review, is there's an increased PE attention to the sector. While we saw the S&P 500 grow by 16+%, private equity has been growing at a higher percent, and we're seeing more affluent investor attention and cash going into PE, which means they've been diversifying their portfolios, including our sector, and that's not news to us. We've certainly seen acquisition and consolidation in the technology, as well as some of the service organizations, even professional services, which have not historically consolidated in our sector. They are getting third-party support through private equity and through acquisition, even some in publicly traded company. And because of that, there's more money flowing into innovation for our sector. This could be a really good thing. I think this industry consolidation, there might be questions about it. There was a lot of first generation founders, and certainly economically, we're seeing a peak period of baby boomer retirements in the next 5 years, which is something to pay attention to, even in your giving programs as you're looking at donors. They're saying, I'm probably going to sell my company the next few years. Get in there and talk about the CRT and get that valuation before they have offer in hand and so forth. So there's questions about optimizing business transition, but certainly it's affecting our sector that services the nonprofit sector as well, from data, tech, as well as services. We're going to see increase in consolidation. Fourth, there's a noticeable buildup in principal and transformational giving programs. Now, it's nothing new to have principal giving. Oftentimes, especially in the higher education and healthcare, where this is more prevalent than in the other sectors, it's the chief development officer or maybe one person that are the top people for bringing in big gifts. We're seeing more of a growth in building a team around principal giving, teams around transformational giving, and really across sectors. I think 4 or 5 of our sectors, we've got clients that are building and making concerted efforts to grow teams around principal and transformational giving and building up capabilities like structured giving to be able to talk about things like business asset transition, life income gifts, how to convert assets, different ways to help be of service to them. Even though they're billionaires, they know how to make money. They've probably never given $100 million gift before, many of them, certainly some, the ones on that top list. But they do need advice. They welcome it, and so we're seeing more capabilities on helping in those areas. I do expect a further slowing of the donor declines. I don't think we're going to see a reversal this year, but I do think that slowing is possible. I think it's important to communicate about the charitable deduction. I know it's not a really compelling copy or narrative from marketing perspective, but thinking creatively how to let people know that they can deduct their giving on top of the standard deduction will have a bump. Also, building authentic engagement programs, becoming smaller, connecting, especially the younger generations care so deeply about authentic communication. And we see that with the popularity of TikTok and Reels and other ways to communicate in ways that people consume information. We expect the AI startup to continue to have some volatility where we'll see several startups to merge and disappear. But what we're seeing is some stability on those focusing on relational fundraising enablement. That means fundraising specifically around the pipeline, lead identification, the verification, feeding into portfolios, optimizing portfolios, nudging gift officer behavior, anything around that pipeline for relational fundraising is where we're seeing some traction. Training gift officers, certainly in that space as well. And then also in the digital marketing, as we look at building up around those authentic communication programs, how we can be more authentic in our communications by incorporating AI are the areas where we're seeing more resilience and less startup and disappear, startup and disappear. The next prediction is really the CRM changes are going to shift beyond Salesforce. And now this is not a negative in Salesforce. They've got such large market share that I do expect them to continue to grow, but the rate of growth based on the large market share might be a little bit different as we see growth in other platforms. We're seeing a growth in Microsoft Dynamics in this space, specifically in fundraising. There's more entries, more opportunities to build out a Microsoft Dynamics path to a giving. We're seeing mid-sized nonprofit offerings. I didn't mean to be exclusive. I just, for the sake of the size, Slate in education, Virtuous, Bloomerang, those that are at that mid-sized nonprofit, we're seeing a little bit more transiency and turnover and looking at new systems, trying to adopt digital tool sets that are having people look a little bit more. A continued growth in Salesforce and continued growth in Blackbaud, where we've seen really large market share. They put up really good performances last year and good earnings. Blackbaud is in a healthy place right now. So we're seeing some growth in the CRM sector and some diversification compared to what were maybe more unidirectional in some of the shifts in recent years, especially from the large organizations. Now, number 8, and the last one I'm going to mention before I jump into a poll and some Q&A, is that business intelligence, BI, charts and graphs and dashboards and real-time communicating with information. I believe that there's a big growth in investment in automated dashboards this year for many reasons. But not only are the tools much better, better aggregation, even new people joining staff that are better skills around Power BI and Tableau and so forth. Some of the AI user interaction and analysis tools are going to have more opportunities for cohorts, cooperative benchmarking, collaborating data across organizations, and interacting with data. The tools have made this much easier where it was much more manual before. And I think because of that, the cost basis for building out cooperative, collaborative benchmarking data, building out automation within our own reporting at our institution at the institution level is becoming much more achievable. So we're expecting big growth in BI in 2026. So with that, as we go into the poll, I just want to bring back one more. I had that qualitative meeting with higher education leaders, and we asked them what word best defines your predictions for 2026 or for your programs. We were expecting more pessimism, more perhaps anxiety or apprehension, but what we saw was optimism. Record-breaking, optimistic, change, growth, promising. Now, there was certainly some turbulence, uncertainty. We had a few cautious, some transition. But overall, I'm always amazed at the optimism in our sector, the drive to help people find their significance, to help each other through charitable giving, and to be a real accelerator of doing good in the world, which is why I'm so proud to support this service, to support all of you, and for all that all of you do in this sector. It brings such meaning to me and to my team members. Thank you for letting us be a part of it. What I'd like to do is we've got a poll that it should be popping up for you, and there's two poll questions before I get in the Q&A. Oftentimes you do the poll after the Q&A, and some of you drop off, which I totally respect. But I do love talking with you. Please do reach out if you have questions, but can't stay for the last few minutes for a Q&A. But if you want someone to contact you about some information, there's that opportunity, as well as I think there's an opportunity to provide us feedback on topics that you'd like to see from webinars. We do look at all those topics, and we do put our webinar schedule together based on the input that you want us to present on. And I believe if I can just move the slide and that poll will stay up there. So as you're doing your poll, maybe some of you already have, maybe add in the chat if there's ways that you've been adapting to changing pressures or uncertainty, either for your organizations or for your donors. And I'm also going to look at the Q&A, and I'm going to address some of the questions. Right now, I've got two in there, and I'm going to try to address a couple, and we'll see if there's more that come in that I don't get to. I will try to respond or have my team respond depending on the topic. Now, the first question from Rachel is, with a lot of corporations giving under 1% of the revenue today, will we see a lot of corporations scrap giving as a whole, or more giving up front on partnerships over or multiple years? I do think there's a big risk of scrapping. I have to be honest. I'm hoping that that's not the case. I'm hoping that our optimism and our generosity improves and continues. Certainly, we see more altruism, typically from individuals or individuals behind the corporate giving. So if there's individuals behind those decisions, we usually generally see more resilience to economic changes. For those that give more for, we benefit from the research, we benefit from a PR exposure, or we benefit from staffing that you provide if you're a school and so forth. Those are likely to have a little bit more strain on them if there's other avenues to do that for those same dollars. I think it's wise to encourage them to think about spreading it out over years or bunching that as a way if they're considering that, or have those conversations with them. What are they planning to do? What is their value? Similar to when people are surveyed about tax implications on their giving, they'll often say tax doesn't motivate them. But when we see tax policy go into effect, we do see shifts in giving. Like the Tax Cuts and Job Act, we saw a 13% decline in mid-level giving. We know it has an impact. So I would just keep open conversations with them, and let's hope that that's not the case. I fear there is going to be some declines in corporate giving, is my personal viewing. That is not the official like Giving USA or BWF position. So what are the top 3 use cases you would be excited to see in nonprofit software? This comes from Bella. Good to Polly. Thank you for that question. I do think I mentioned on the BI and automated reporting, I think the consuming of data in the hands of everyday users is very important to people, and we're seeing that. And as the most common thing is, it's not just a better tool set, but how can our users consume it in a more practical way? I would say that's one. Second, I would say integration across platforms, like with digital marketing and with other ways that we can integrate with platform and other marketing, comes up certainly with the marketing and annual giving and those areas. I think for the integration, I would also, even though I use that for the digital, I think for the high net worth, as we're seeing some of these platform AI companies emerge, a better integration around platform support. The bottom line is the affluent are driving philanthropy, and tool sets that help us build relationships with high net worth donors often are where a lot of people favor and look, whether that's prospect management, integration, flexibility. If we're a matrix organization like a university with colleges or a national nonprofit with different regions, how can we have bespoke to our region or to our college while also having an integrated approach on prospect management and so forth, does come up quite frequently. Those are the ones off the top of my head, but thank you. I'll keep thinking on others of those. Some assessment on NIL and revenue sharing landscape and higher education vertical. Do we see support for non-athletics going down? This is a harder one to say. I mean, historically, what we've seen is athletics has often been the entry point in giving. In fact, I've looked at some universities where the majority of donors to other areas' first gift ever was to athletics. So it's often like a starter gift in some ways. I think where we could see this actually grow is if we can leverage that into a broader experience with our institution. This is where donor experience matters, investment in our donor relations, because if that history proves that there's an increase in giving to NIL, I think that's an opportunity to fill the base. So I have more optimism about that, but I think we need to be strategic to grab hold of that optimism. And the questions on the AI use cases, I would say lead generation is still strong, but I think more bespoke lead generation, not just are you likely to be philanthropic, but are you likely to give to this campaign priority, which is where we've been focusing a lot of our AI, and that's been coming up. Other AI use cases would probably be in mass customization through authentic communication. And I'd say training has been an area where we've seen AI officers. Like at GiveSee, we've seen AI donors to practice on, like with Practivated. We've been building AI analysts to do your analytics for you in many ways to automate that. And so I think there's many areas that potential. Certainly the generative with categorizing data, it might not sound sexy, but it's certainly really popular to say to have large amount of information, the history, even if I'm meeting with a donor. Let's say I'm a university. I'm sorry, I've used a few university examples, and someone says, I really care a lot about, I don't know, sustainable agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. You can say, all right, who has written a paper on that? Oh, I've got this professor. Like, you should meet this professor. And you were able to find that quickly as opposed to the deep search. I think even the access to information is a use case that's not specific to a fundraising database, but it's a use case that officers will often lean on. And now there's some thank you, Bala. And then Danilin, thank you for your question on the Chronicle recently published a newsletter that cited concerns that the nonprofit sector may see data gaps. Do we think that concern is realistic? I think this might be the case. I don't have firsthand knowledge. I do know that we get data from the IRS for the Giving USA, which I do have some access to, as well as support from the great groups like Candid, from CASE and others that help inform that data. So it is likely that there could be some delay in the IRS reporting. I don't expect that they're going to slow down in revenue generation activities, even though that they're going to be more strained. So I do expect taxes to be received. So the primary group of those giving dollars, I think, will be still reportable. But I think other nonprofit sector data gaps, I think you might lean more on the university sector for some of that. I know Maryland has done some good work on volunteering, the Do Good Institute. I know Stanford has done some. If you look at the generositycommission.org, the Generosity Commission report has a lot of good reports that cites other people researching in the space. There's others doing research, but I think that that's a legitimate concern. Now, I realize I'm at time. I'm probably supposed to do something with with the polls. Aaron or Lauren from our events team chime in if I should do so. But I think I'm just going to leave this on the screen, not knowing, unless you let me know that I should. And I wanted to thank you all for participating. I am at time, and I know there's probably more questions. There's a lot of comments in the chat. I want to again thank you, like I did at the end of my presentation, and reach out to my friends in Minneapolis. We're here with you. We feel the situation with you, and it's so meaningful that this sector is doing good in the world. And let's latch onto that optimism in both in our communities. And thank you for all the support that we've heard from so many of you to us for being a Minneapolis company. It means so much to us. Um, I love you all dearly. I'm proud to be part of the nonprofit sector. I'll go out, raise a lot of money, help people find their significance, and do good in the world. Thank you so much.